Welcome back. Chapter 5, Part 2 here. We're going to take a look at the eukaryotic organisms themselves. We're going to run through some different examples of the most common types of microscopic organisms from the eukaryotic kingdom, eukaryotic domain, that is. And these will include things like the fungi. These will include things like the protozoa, the algae, and the helminths. We touched on all these back in Chapter 1, but we're going to go into a little more detail here in Chapter 5. So we're going to start with the fungi. Fungi are their own kingdom, technically referred to as Kingdom Mycete, but we just usually refer to them as the fungi kingdom. Something like 100,000 known species of fungi, probably many that have not yet to be discovered by science. And they occur in both a single and multicellular form, if you recall from Chapter 1. The truth is, most are single-celled, and it's only those that we typically notice that we would consider multicellular. So just looking here ahead real quick, the mushrooms are considered the multicellular fungi. Now, a real quick note about the multicellular fungi. I know we don't usually talk about larger organisms, but there's an interesting concept to discuss just real quick about them. And that is when we think of a fungus, the first thing that might pop in your head is the mushroom, like I just showed there. And the truth is, the mushroom is actually one of the life cycle stages of a multicellular fungi. It's not necessarily the fungus itself, it's actually just one of the life stages that it goes into when it's ready to release spores and reproduce. So fungi are spore producers. So one of the questions, actually the first question on the study guide says, what is the biological purpose of the mushroom or fruiting bodies of macroscopic fungi? So I want to address that question here. To do that, I'm going to pull up this figure. The fungi, multicellular fungi, they actually exist in the soil just beneath the surface in a structure called mycelium. Here you can see it down here. These thread-like structures almost look like roots of a tree. Those are actually referred to as mycelium. And the mycelium is the fungus itself. That's technically where the form of the fungus year-round. It's only under ideal conditions of temperature and nutrients and sunlight and all these different ideal conditions that the fungi actually reproduces, and in doing so produces the mushroom cap itself. So here you can see the mushroom kind of in multiple stages. They're showing here is an early stage and a slightly more advanced stage, and then ultimately it grows into a fully mature mushroom cap here. Let's see, I think I have another picture. Here's another one showing the same kind of thing. So the mycelium, or what actually exists year-round, and it's the fungus, or the mushroom cap that is, that's produced under the ideal conditions when it's time to reproduce. You can see another figure showing kind of the same thing, going through a variety of developmental stages here. So they do this as a way to release spores into the air. So the question again is, what is the purpose of the mushroom, which to clarify, the mushroom is technically referred to as a quote-unquote fruiting body. And so the purpose is to release spores and help them disperse into the air. And the idea is that the spores want to be elevated from the ground so that the wind can carry them theoretically a good distance away from the initial, call it the mother fungus if you want to. And the idea is that if the spores all get released in the same area, there's more competition and fewer resources available for each one of those spores. So by elevating off the ground and allowing those to catch from the wind, at least theoretically, that allows them to disperse further and ultimately spread those out so that each has a better chance of getting its own nutrient supply. So that's the purpose of a fruiting body of a multicellular fungi. And by the way, that's also one of the reasons why you tend to see fungi show up in the same place every year. If you've noticed, maybe you have fungi growing in your backyard or somewhere near you, they tend to show up in the same place. And that's because they never really go away. They're there year-round, and it's only during certain times of the year that the mushroom is produced. And that's why you tend to see them in the same spot every time. Now, the microscopic fungi exist in two forms. One is called a yeast, the other is called a hyphae. Yeast are what we know as yeast, and these are actually a type of fungi. You may not have ever thought about it that way, but yeast are actually a type of fungi. They're shown here in an oval kind of round shape, and they reproduce through a process known as budding in pull up an image here of that in just 1 second. The other type are the hyphae, and these are what we refer to as mold fungi. So if you probably know what mold is, and that's actually a type of fungi called the hyphae fungi. At the microscopic level, they exist in a thread-like structure, kind of like the mycelium of the multicellular fungi. So once again, here's the mycelium. They're very much like the mycelium of the multicellular fungi. Here is a few images. So here's a comparison of the yeast and the mold. Here's an image of the yeast actually budding. So here's an individual yeast cell. And what they actually do is they just kind of split apart. You'll probably find a better image of that here. There's a good picture. They just essentially split apart and kind of pinch in two, and they do this over and over and over again, and that's referred to as budding. Here's a diagram showing the cell budding out, pinching apart, and becoming two cells. Go back here real quick. The mold fungi, the hyphae, here's what they look like up close. And they actually are very similar in a lot of ways to the multicellular fungi, just on a much smaller scale. So you can actually see here, although it's not shown very well, you can actually see what you're looking at down here are the hyphae. And then what you're actually seeing here are the reproductive structures that they produce when they get ready to release their spores. So they also produce spores. And the hyphae differentiate into these structures called a sporangia, which then actually carries the spores and releases those into the air, a lot like the multicellular fungi. Here's another figure showing the hyphae in the, here we go. Here's another figure showing the hyphae in the sporangia here, the spores. So here's the hyphae. They would spread out in whatever surface or what we call the substrate they're growing in. And then kind of like the mushroom, they extend this structure here called a sporangia that then releases the spores. So here you can see another picture of that. So they're actually like miniature mushrooms in a lot of ways. They look a little different, but they're very, very similar in how they function. So the hyphae are like the mycelium, and the sporangia are kind of like the mushroom itself. And when you're actually looking at bread mold, for example, going back here, you're actually looking at thousands, if not millions, of individual little hyphae and sporangia growing up out of the bread. So the mycelium are spreading and kind of reaching their tentacles, so to speak, the hyphae, into the bread, sucking up the nutrients. And once they get enough nutrients, they start to then sprout these little sporangia, which then go on to release spores and will theoretically make even more fungi. So deep inside that substrate, you've got the mycelium, or excuse me, the hyphae, and then what you actually kind of start to see here is this fuzzy texture, are those sporangia as they pop up and start to reproduce. Pretty gross, but that's the nature of fungi. And as they do so, they suck the nutrients out of whatever they're growing on, and that's one of the ways that they can actually decompose matter and break things down. Now, while we have two distinct forms, yeast and hyphae, some fungi can actually exist as both in what we refer to as dimorphic fungi. Dimorphic fungi can exist in either form and can actually transition back and forth depending on the conditions. Usually temperature is what changes them from one form to the other. One of the things I want you to know is that this is a characteristic of many pathogenic fungi. Often pathogens in the fungi kingdom are more adaptable to different environments. So all fungi at some point in their life will exist in the soil. I shouldn't say all fungi, I take that back. Most fungi at some point in their life will exist outside of a living organism, in the soil, in the water, somewhere in the environment. And then if they get into a human or another animal, they have the potential, some species have the potential to cause infection. And typically it's those that are dimorphic, because in some cases it's more desirable to be in a yeast form, and then in other cases it's more desirable to be in a hyphae form. So by being able to transition back and forth, they're better able to adapt from the environment to a living thing, and then theoretically back and forth. So they're kind of more adaptable in either type of environment. Now, fungi in a lot of ways seem like plants. They look like plants to a certain extent, at least in the sense that they kind of have these root-like tentacles. They stay in the ground. They don't seem to move. They don't move around. So if you looked at them, you might think, well, they're probably closely related to plants. But the truth is, they're actually nothing at all like a plant, other than the fact that they tend to grow out of the ground and they stay in one place. That's pretty much the only thing they actually have in common with plants. And really what fungi are is they're considered heterotrophic, which is the same type of organism as you and I are, as humans and other animals, which means that we don't make our own food like plants. We have to consume food from preformed sources. So in other words, plants are the opposite of heterotrophic. They're what we call autotrophic. That means they make their own food using sunlight, for example. Every other type of organism is a heterotroph. And that just means they basically eat things that are already available for them. They don't make their own food, basically, is what it means. And so in that sense, they're a lot like you and I, that we actually have to go find food and eat it as opposed to making it ourselves. So they're a lot like animals in that sense, and they're really actually nothing at all like plants. In fact, fungi are more closely related to insects than they are to plants. Now, most fungi are a type of heterotroph called a saprobe. So a saprobe is kind of like a division of the heterotrophic organism group. Saprobes are generally organisms that feed off of dead organic matter. So when we talk about them finding food, they usually feed off of some kind of dead, rotting source of food. Dead leaves, dead animals. This could also include waste, so it doesn't always have to be dead, but it could also mean things like fecal matter and dead skin cells and hair and things like that. So saprobes typically feed off of kind of decaying type matter. In this sense, they typically are fairly harmless. Most saprobes are relatively harmless, meaning that they're not parasites or any kind of pathogen. And they're typically those that just exist out in nature, relatively harmless to you and I. When we talked earlier in chapter 1 about the vast majority of microbes being harmless, the vast majority of microbes are what we consider saprobes. It means they just kind of feed off stuff that's already dead organic matter and waste, and they typically don't get energy from living things. Now, there are some that are parasites, meaning that they do get their energy from a living organism, and that means that they obviously cause potential problems, infections, and disease. So those that do lead to, have the potential, that is, to lead to infection, called mycosis. Mycosis is a term for a fungal infection. Now, luckily, there's not very many human pathogens and not very many animal pathogens. There are, however, quite a few plant pathogens. We're not going to get into too many of those here, but it is important to recognize that there's a much greater number of fungal plant pathogens than there are fungal animal pathogens. But here you are seeing a picture of someone who's got a fairly severe form of mycosis in which the fungi is growing on the outer part of their foot here. So the idea is that fungi tend to be free living, meaning they don't require a host, and that goes back to the idea of them being saprobes. I mean, they just kind of grow in the environment. If you remember in chapter 1, part 2, we talked about the difference between a primary pathogen and an opportunistic pathogen. We said primary pathogens are those that cause infection to people that are otherwise healthy, whereas opportunistic pathogens tend to cause infection in people that have a weakened immune system. I also added that opportunistic pathogens can sometimes take advantage of certain locations. Going back to this figure here, this picture, this individual could have an infection just because of the location. It could also be that they have a weak immune system, but on the outer part of your skin, you don't really have any immune cells. The very outer layer of your skin is a layer of dead skin cells. And here there's no actual immunity until you go beneath the surface a certain distance. So some fungi can actually cause infection on the very outer parts of our skin, sometimes in the hair, and that's because there's really no immune system there. Only when they penetrate below the surface do they start to activate the immune system. So when we say most fungi are opportunists, what that means, opportunistic and pathogens, what that means is that they either only cause infection in people who have a weak immune system, or they only cause infection in certain areas of the body where someone doesn't have any immune cells to begin with. There's only about 4 fungi that I am aware of that are considered primary fungal pathogens, and those are fungi that could actually cause infection to a healthy individual. And they're so rare I usually don't even talk about them. But if you type in primary fungal pathogens, you'll come up with a list of about 4 of those, and they're actually able to suppress the immune system of a healthy individual and therefore cause infection once they've kind of weakened your immune system. They're incredibly rare. You could probably go an entire lifetime in the medical field and never see a single example of it. So it's not something that you would ever really be likely to encounter, or certainly be likely to ever experience yourself. But they do exist. There are documented cases of it. But typically, when you have a fungal infection, usually, again, besides being on the outer part of your skin, besides being a part of the body where you don't have immune cells, outside of those, they are almost always in people who have a weak immune system. Someone who might be on chemotherapy, someone who might have an organ transplant, who's on immune suppressants, someone who maybe has unmanaged HIV and AIDS. Those are scenarios where the immune system has become so compromised and weakened for a variety of reasons that suddenly these fungi that would normally not be a problem and normally would be very easy for our immune system to eliminate, suddenly they start to potentially cause infection. And that's where you typically see fungal infections. Now, the other place that fungi cause issues is with allergies. Mold and mold spores and things like that are a fairly common source of everyday allergies. So that's another issue where it's not real serious, but certainly a problem. The other area where fungi are problematic is when it comes to plants and crops. As I mentioned back here, there are lots of fungal plant pathogens. And what this basically means is that they will kind of devour your crop as they grow little mold spores and hyphae into the food and suck the nutrients out of it. In fact, they're such a major concern that in some cases, untreated or in just a kind of a bad year, they can actually be responsible for up to 40% of fruit crop damage. Every year is different, every farm is different, every location is different, so these are just kind of general estimates. But the idea is that fungi can potentially cause a serious issue to farmers if they are not taking steps to remove that. That's why a lot of farms use fungicides and considered a general type of pesticide. A lot of people are against that because they like to eat food that's free of those, which is understandable. But it's important to recognize that they use those for good reason, because if they don't, in some cases you can lose up to half your crops just from the fungi alone, and not to mention insects or other pathogens or other types of pests that could come along and take out an individual's crop. So there are good reasons why people use those types of chemicals, even though it's highly undesirable for the consumer for good reason. Now, the last thing about fungi is that they can also be used in the lab to synthesize different types of compounds on an industrial level. Things like antibiotics, for example. Penicillin is a drug that is actually derived from a certain type of fungi. Some of the cephalosporin types of antibiotics come from fungi, so they're actually fairly efficient producers of antibiotic compounds. They can obviously be used to make yeast, and they can, alcohol from the yeast. Baker's yeast and things like that are used to release CO2 and make bread rise. And even they can even be used to produce things like B vitamins. So they can be used to kind of churn out biological compounds that can be purified and sold for commercial uses. Okay, next we're going to take a look at the Proteas. If you remember, Proteas are the single-celled eukaryotic organisms, and they include the algae and the protozoa. So that's kind of a review from chapter 1. Now, algae, if you remember, I analogized to little plants. They are photosynthetic, and they're basically the opposite of heterotrophs. So you have autotrophs and heterotrophs, and algae are considered autotrophs, and that means that they make their own energy. When it comes to something that makes its own energy, it rarely requires another organism for subsistence, which is what a parasite is. A parasite and a pathogen is typically an organism that is feeding off of another organism for its own nutrients, and by doing so causes harm. So when you find something like an algae that doesn't really need another organism to produce food, what you find is that they're rarely ever pathogenic, because the only reason that an organism is typically pathogenic is because it's trying to feed off of another organism. Now, there are exceptions. The textbook talks about an exception of a very rare type of algae that has kind of lost its ability to be photosynthetic and has become parasitic by virtue of that loss of its own ability to make food. But that's definitely a total outlier, an exception, one I don't usually get into. There is an example though where algae can be problematic in that they kind of like mushrooms, they can produce toxins that can be poisonous, and that's typically where you see the most issue when it comes to algae being something along the lines of problematic to people or animals. So an example would be like a red tide. Pull up an image here of that. Red tide is a situation where these algae are releasing toxins, certain types of algae are releasing toxins, and that actually then can permeate into the water and kill fish and other animals in relatively large numbers. And red tide is a situation that the algae are essentially producing a toxin that affects other living things around them. Another example is a algae called Ciguatera. I think I'm pronouncing that right. Another one that produces a toxin that can be accumulated in fish and actually cause toxins to build up from smaller fish to larger fish as they move up the food scale. So here's a picture showing that. Here's the toxins from the algae, and they kind of move up the food chain, concentrating in the smaller fish, which then concentrate in the larger fish and then the larger fish, and then potentially someone that eats those could actually get sick. Not something that's real common, but in certain areas of the world shown here, there is a chance of that happening, especially here in these red areas certain times of the year. So Ciguatera blooms will occur. A lot of times fishermen will avoid those areas during certain times of the year. But that's typically where algae cause the most amount of harm, is when they release toxins. Here's another example, Physacidia, not one I'd ever make you spell, don't worry about that. Another type of algae that releases toxins. This one actually goes on to cause skin lesions and ulcers on the skin that can actually be toxic, and in certain cases have been shown to release large amounts of toxins in very large algae blooms, and have been known in some cases to kill off millions and millions of fish. This here is an image shown from above where you see many, many thousands of fish all dying simultaneously, and that is attributed to a large release of toxins from this type of algae. It's a very complicated type of algae. This type of runoff, or this type of algal bloom and toxicity has actually been linked to agricultural runoff, and they found in areas where there are agricultural farms, like pig farms especially, near water systems like oceans and rivers, these types of problems tend to be worse, and that's because the fecal matter from the pig farms tend to get into the water, which act as a source of nutrients for the algae, which causes them to grow and potentially create these large blooms. So these are something that we've been able to control a little bit better in the last decade or so, but have in the past been a major issue in areas where agricultural runoff has not been properly controlled.